The show you have been waiting for. We hear about it constantly. It's here. Predicting the 2025 first and second rounds. For redraft, we also are going to throw in a little bit of an extra fun exercise this year in Superflex at the end. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz. And as always, we always talk through this for anyone who doesn't remember. We're predicting 12 months in advance what the first round and second round are going to look like next year. Obviously, this exercise is meant to help us understand the fragile profiles, the profiles we expect to break out, some of those things. And it really tests your expectations for what the hits can look like in year one. We always like to do this as a tight end premium format. So we mix in, some of the elite tight ends, and then we decided to add Superflex this year so we can talk about some of the quarterbacks that we think are going to be at the top of that position as well by this time next year. But it's all a look ahead. And I was just saying to you, Shawn, and then I was like, screw it, we just need to start the show because I want to say it to the listeners too. I'm literally, for the first time, we just threw everything in the same spreadsheet and then click record. I'm seeing yours for the first time. And I said, I love that that I get to do this with you, and yours are always so much more fun than mine. And so, I mean, it's great for me because I can take some pretty firm stances and I don't look like the zealot at all. Like you're definitely going to be even further than me. I don't have to be boring, but if I did this with somebody else, I would look like a zealot, and you're even more so. But Shawn, this year, more than any year that we've ever done this, and we've done it for maybe 4 years now, I want to say, was the hardest one for me. It's a really tricky year. We know that there's a pretty firm top 12 in redraft this year, and there's no real profiles there that are like, we're out on. Like a few years ago, it was like, oh, we can just take Derrick Henry out of our next year's rankings or whatever it is, some aging running back. There's a couple guys at the back end of that are obviously banged up right now, Puka Nacua, Jahmyr Gibbs, but they still factor into this question for next year. And then that second round, which we've talked about a ton, is a really long and wide tier. And there's a lot of names there that I wanted to be able to include. In addition to the not to spoiler alert, but I'm not taking a whole lot of the 12 names at the top of drafts this year out of my first 2 rounds for next year. And then there's the guys that we always want to talk about that we think can break out and wrestle their way in from round 8, right? And there's some profiles. So this was a year where we always talk a little about honorable mentions. I could have easily done a third round. It's really interesting. We've, Shawn, often had very similar lists. I will tell the viewers right now before we go through them, they're different this year. And I don't think they're different because of a huge disagreement, but I'm really intrigued to see how you went through the exercise. I'm excited to share how I went through the exercise. I think you could have landed a lot of different ways. And so it'll be fun to get a couple different perspectives on that.
It will. And one of the things that made, the first, I would say, certainly 6 picks, but even that entire first round is that, this year's first round is good. And even the guys who are kind of after the first tier break, it's not that there is a question about what they will be next year, right? It's not a question of, is Justin Jefferson going to fall off? It's a matter of how good does he look this year, and does that push him back to the 101? It's not a question of, is Amon-Ra St. Brown going to fall off? It's a question of, if the other guys in that offense are as good as we think they are, then how high can he stay when it's going to hurt his ceiling a little bit? And then when you're thinking about running backs versus receivers, it's this question of just how, let's just say, legendary, as our buddy Pat has done such a great job of coining, how amazing, how tournament winning will those running back seasons be? Because they're going to have to be very good to keep them even where they are this year. So Ben, as we're working through this, it's based for me off of this idea of a sort of neutral format, but a neutral format with tight end premium. So some people are going to say that's not that neutral then, but I'm thinking through it from a 2-2-2 perspective, where you do have the flexibility to play running backs if you so desire. You do have the flexibility to play even a second tight end if things would work out that way for you. You're not forced structurally to make decisions that kind of push us off of like who are going to be the best scorers, like what's the best super team. And
so you're clarifying that you're talking about a format where running backs are a little bit more valuable even than the heavy receiver formats. But I'm looking at your list and I don't know if you know that running backs exist. Just another little spoiler as we get through it. But I'm like, in this format, you've got it as a little
then you
bit
have,
of a,
oh no, you have two more running backs.
two more running backs. I mean, when it's 50% more running backs as well, if we want to do it on a percentage basis.
That's true. That's true.
I'm not massively higher on the running backs, but I'm just kidding with you.
It's going to be fun. I mean, it's going to be fun because not only do I not have that many, but I don't have them at the top. I love that you do.
Yeah, let's jump into it. Because we'd like to, kind of talk through what we were thinking and why we were thinking it. I mean, again, I mentioned this before. In past years, we've had some real similarities. There's some big differences here. And yet there's ways that I think I can kind of group it that are similar. So looking at the first half of the first round, I start with Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall as my 101 and my 102. And then I go to 5 straight receivers. You, Sean, start with 5 straight receivers. Our first 4 are the same names, and we both have in different orders. And we both have Tyreek Hill as our 5th receiver. So that means, I'm kind of saying this confusingly, but you have Tyreek Hill at 105 because you're starting with 5 receivers. You have those other 4 receivers at 1 through 4. I have Tyreek Hill at 107 because I started with the 2 running backs. I have those other 4 receivers at 103 through 106. But a very similar start there. You also have Bijan at 106 as your RB1. So we both have Bijan as our RB1s this coming year. But I mean, I think my answer, you just mentioned, I have these guys at the top of the running back group, is fairly straightforward, that people like to draft running backs. And I think Bijan and Breece could have some really strong seasons in a way that people will be back to wanting to take them 1st and 2nd overall. I'm more curious about your answer, which is we've been moving this direction over time. You're predicting a continued shift towards receivers at the very top of drafts, and that next year, and these receivers are very, very strong. And the 4 names are for you, it's Justin Jefferson at 101, who you mentioned. Maybe he could be back at 101. You're projecting that. I have him as my wide receiver 2. You have Garrett Wilson, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase as your first 4. I go CeeDee because I do think he's going to have such an exceptional year that he'll still be the wide receiver 1 next year. Then Jefferson, then Chase, then Garrett Wilson. This is a great example of one of those ones where I've moved Garrett Wilson up to wide receiver 4. I had him a little higher, but I gave Chase the nod because of the quarterback stuff where we don't know if even Rodgers is playing next year, and Joe Burrow is going to be there. And I moved Garrett back down to wide receiver 4, and now I look like I'm an anti-Garrett Wilson fan. I'm a fake Garrett Wilson fan over here because you have him at 102. But we have those 2 guys as our top, those 4 guys as our top 4. And as I said, I had Garrett as high as wide receiver 2 for a moment and was kind of shuffling. So I think probably fairly similar in how we're seeing that group. And then we both have Tyreek Hill behind that. Like, he's going to have a good year, but he's going to be 31 next year. So a little bit of a different thing. But yeah, so those are the receivers you have at the top. But the key for me that I think is very fascinating is you have all 5 of those receivers before running back, and then you have Bijan there. Again, I have those top 2 running backs 1 and 2, and I think that's when we've done this exercise in the past. We've sometimes said this guy that has a great running back season is going to go 1. The way that you're projecting this is a more intriguing from the growth of fantasy football perspective and what it means into 2025 that we might have 5 receivers at the top of draft. So what are you thinking when you line it up that way?
So we have a variety of interlocking elements to this, which I do think is fun. I'm going to reference a couple of articles that went sort of deep into the weeds on these players. Obviously, folks can check those out at RotoViz if they are interested. But Ben, I wrote a piece on Kyren Williams that was titled something to the effect of, this is for the I'm probably going to be wrong files. But Kyron Williams looks like the best value since LaShawn McCoy in 2016.
As far as early running backs are concerned.
Right. Right. Yeah. And you had McCoy drop into round 3. It was a little bit of a different situation, right? Because he was an aging back who had a down season in his move to Buffalo, and then he blows up. So it's not apples and apples, right? But with Kyron Williams, we have this concern about Blake Corum. My point in the piece, which isn't meant to say definitively that any particular scenario is going to take place, but it's to help me calibrate on how you should price the different scenarios, which is that Kyron Williams rescued the Rams running game. He's far better than Blake Corum. But then the piece that's relevant here is that if we're concerned about him losing touches, and I think that's a relevant concern, right? A team goes out and makes that selection. You're like, man, I mean, they're probably going to use that guy some. But the thing that stood out for me is that the backups to Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson are objectively and from an evidence-based perspective, in terms of what we know now, in terms of what has occurred in the past, those guys are very clearly better than Blake Corum, and by enough of a margin that certainly if we're concerned about Blake Corum, we should be concerned that Breece Hall is going to lose touches to Braylon Allen and that Bijan Robinson is going to lose touches to Tyler Algier. The Falcons have more or less come out and said that's going to be the case, even though when their offensive coordinator has had other chances or been involved in offenses, it did actually consolidate for the start. And that's been one of your points, and I'm sure it's one of the reasons you have him at the 101. I think that definitely could happen. I'm thinking through, how I want to price these scenarios. And then, Ben, there's also this element that the Aaron Rodgers Hackett offenses have actually used a running back to siphon quite a bit. Now, again, there can be specific things where even though the running back one in those offenses were talented, wasn't Breece Hall. I mean, Breece Hall has a chance to be a top 5 running back ever. We're talking about a guy who's better than Adrian Peterson, a guy who is basically David Johnson and Jonathan Taylor put together, a guy who is a legitimate challenger to this group that's like LaDainian Tomlinson and Jamal Charles and Barry Sanders and Marshall Faulk. He's a challenger to that group.
Jim Brown. I mean, can we just keep naming like the greatest running backs of all time?
He's a challenger to that group. And so that for me is tough because, I mean, you think about who he is and then you watch Braylon Allen run in the preseason week 1 and it's like everything that he did in college, where that dude as a 17-year-old was better than a lot of these guys were last year at 24, right? You watch him in preseason week 1, you're like, this dude's already a top 10 running back in the NFL. Why did some other team that needed a running back not select him?
Right. He looked incredible for the Jets in preseason week 1.
So my concern is that as we move into this era where fantasy managers understand the importance of receivers, and we also have some fantastically good wide receivers, that the EP profiles or the volume profiles or what have you from Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall are going to be, or just, again, when we think through scenarios, there are a lot of scenarios in which their volume profiles are mildly disappointing and they have to hit these massive efficiency outcomes to score the way that we want. Now, they're good enough to do that. I certainly wouldn't discount the idea that they just, I mean, I think both of those guys can hit 25 points per game. If they do, they're going to go 1-2. So, I mean, that part for me is fun. And again, it's so fun to do the exercise because you look at this and you're like, man, round 1 could be really good in 2025. That part of it I love. The other thing with Breece, who I have below Robinson and McCaffrey, is again, this kind of element of like, how is that offense going to manifest? And at a certain point, you can't act like they're going to score every single time they have the ball all season, especially if Aaron Rodgers wants to like stand at the line and pretend that he is doing quantum physics, right?
Right.
If I have Garrett Wilson at 102, it's going to be a little bit problematic for Breece Hall.
Man, a lot of really great stuff to unpack there. I agree with you on the Breece Hall talent. I've been Bijan over Breece pretty much all off season. So you have Breece here at 12, which I mean you just described is in part because of the way his offense could look, in part because Braylon Allen is a good enough player. The one thing that I wanted to jump in there on is that quote from the coaching staff, or I think it was from Robinson directly about Bijan, about Algier. And my very Bijan pilled biased interpretation, because he said something like, we're going to use Algier a bunch this year. And then in his next sentence, he sort of restated it as, at some point this season, he's going to have a huge role. And it was like, it clicked in his head. It was like, well, we're not going to use him a lot when Bijan's healthy, but Bijan's probably not going to play all 17 games perfectly healthy and not need a little bit of a break. So at some point, we'll have Algier ready to go in a 17-game season.
Way you could read that is that, as they get into the season, I mean, it's going to be 1A, 1B.
Yeah, sure. That's how everyone's read it. That's how Twitter's read it, Sean. That's,
I mean, really, that seems absurd.
Island.
It's going to be 1 and 2.
Right.
There's a massive gulf.
I think there's a pretty huge gulf.
Tyler Algier is good, right?
Yeah.
He was covered up by how poorly they ran the offense last year. And the advanced stats that we use in the Advanced Stat Explorer from SIS suggest that the run blocking for the Falcons cratered. And so, there are lots of contextual reasons to believe both backs will make a huge jump from an efficiency perspective. I like that you have Bijan at 101 because, he's going to lose some touches. But my whole point is that we want to calibrate on these various guys who are ranked or who are being drafted in the top 3 rounds, that some of the distinctions are probably sharper in drafters' minds than they should be when the situations are more similar. But again, the most recent team, I say the most recent team, one of the things is just that Corum and Allen were drafted in different places, but Allen is very clearly far better. You've got to consider that when you're thinking about how backups are going to affect the starter.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And you've always said this, and it is something that, for people who don't track, I always like to say this, like, you have a strong track record with, like, you're one of the first people, and I've credited you with this in the past of the show, one of the first people that really helped me understand that, like, the RB3 on a team impacts the way that you view the RB1. It's a reality thing where if they don't have any other good players, they're just going to give the one player the ball every time. But when they do have other good players, not necessarily the RB3, but in some cases, right? Like, if you have multiple other good backs, you start thinking through the contingency scenarios. Even if the backup gets banged up, well, they still have another good talented back there. And really so you putting Hall at 12 is not about Hall. It's about Braylon Allen being a really exciting handcuff target, especially if you haven't drafted Breece.
It's so frustrating.
It is. It's a little bit frustrating for sure. And I think you have me sold that because I do think that's a real concern. And I wrote about that after preseason week 1, that I was that high on Braylon. And I've not taken a ton of Breece. So I don't think that me putting him at 102 is consistent with what I've actually felt on him. I think it was kind of a hedge on my part. You took the more extreme. Breece is going to fall next year. Now, I do think even if the way that I put it in my preseason week 1 recap is that Braylon Allen, at some point this season, that I said the people that pay a lot of attention to like very specific usage stuff might tell you that Braylon Allen's a real issue for Breece because of like how much touches and stuff he's getting. And yet it's probably not as much of an issue as it seems because Breece Hall's really, really good. And so like, I don't know that he needs 95% of the touches. You just were talking about him. I couldn't think of another back other than Jim Brown to add to the list because I was like, those guys aren't even good because you've named every great running back ever. Like, I thought of Tony Dorsett and Eric Dickerson and Emmitt Smith, and I was like, but those guys are like a half step down, frankly, in my opinion, from a lot of these other names. I thought of OJ Simpson, who maybe belongs on that list, but not usually the comp that anyone ever wants to be comped to. But you were naming like literally all of the greatest running backs of the last 25 years. Did you say Marshall Faulk? I think you mentioned Marshall Faulk, LaDainian Tomlinson, every good player. If Breece Hall's in that category and has a strong season, I mean, he's still going to get the lion's share of the work. Even if he gets 70% and he has a strong season, people are going to be like, he's so good that I want to take him top 5, I think. So, I mean, I still, even with some of your concerns being very valid, I think probably we should split the difference and be having him somewhere in the middle of round 1. Speaking of the middle. And there's another point here as well, though, because you have Garrett Wilson 102, and I found it hard to rank Brees 2 and Wilson 6, knowing that Aaron Rodgers could retire in October of 2024 of this year and just decide that he's done. So who really knows with him and what their quarterback situation could look like in 2025 and those things. Your answer was that Brees Hall is the one that slides a little bit more. And so, yeah, my top 6 goes Bijan, Brees, CD, Jefferson, Chase, Garrett, kind of uninteresting. And then Tyreek 7, as I mentioned. Your top 6 is Justin Jefferson, Garrett, Lamb, Chase, Hill, Robinson, Bijan Robinson at 6. So all 6 of your top 6 are in my top 7. The guy in my top 7, Brees, at 2, that's outside of your top 6 is Brees, who you have all the way back at 112, which means that your 107 is a name that we have not mentioned yet. He's a name that I don't have in my first round. He's your tight end 1. I don't think the listeners are going to be overly concerned about this. I do have him in my second round. I don't have him as my tight end 1 or even tight end 2. It's Brock Bowers at 107 next year, Shawn. You are that encouraged. I will note that Brock Bowers' usage in the first preseason game was awesome. It was so fun to see. We got legitimate 2 tight end sets. Now, somebody brought up to me well, this may not happen when Devonta Adams is healthy, and that's probably fair, or not healthy, is playing. That's probably fair. Maybe they were just pushing the 2 tight end sets more because they wanted to, to get that stuff worked out. At the same time, their number 3 receiver is probably rotational deep threat and mostly special teams are Trey Tucker, who's okay. Who's, but not going to be an every down player necessarily. It would make sense for them to be Adams and Jacoby Myers and then the 2 tight ends. And the way that they did it on 14 snaps with their first team, their first drive went 14 snaps down the field. It was really intriguing. 9 snaps of 2 tight ends. And for almost all of them, Mayer was in line like a traditional tight end, but Bowers was everywhere. He played outside wide. He played alongside Mayer where they were both in line on some run plays so they could break the huddle and split him out or whatever. And then when they got to the red zone, he motioned to fullback and then lined up at fullback twice more, actually. It was 3 different plays in the red zone. It's like that was part of their red zone package was to put Bowers at fullback. One of those 3 plays, he ran into the flat and they threw it to him in the flat. He caught a pass. Didn't score TD or anything, but got a short, red zone reception there. He also caught a pass on a slant from the out wide alignment. On the 5 snaps where they only had 1 tight end in, Mayer actually played more. He played 3 of those and Bowers played 2, but that meant that Bowers played 11 of 14 snaps on this very first drive in his very first preseason game. And when you think through the way that rookie usage builds throughout the season, the fact that it looks like he's going to play even 70% or 75% of the snaps by week 1, that they have packages for him, that they're going to move him around, to me is incredibly bullish because he's talented enough that we then think that his playing time is going to be strong throughout the year as it builds. That to me, Shawn, still doesn't answer the question of how he's the 107 next year. So the usage was great in the early preseason stuff, but what does his season look like this year that puts him at 107?
Well, again, as we kind of calibrate on how drafters are going to approach this in a tight end premium format. Right now, Sam Laporta is the 202, Travis Kelce is the 204, Trey McBride is the 205. So the idea that an elite tight end would certainly be drafted in the first 2 rounds is kind of par for the course in this type of format. You think about the advantage that Travis Kelce has given in big chunks of his career, and he would be a very legitimate first-round pick. What you have to then determine is how likely is Bowers to have the type of rookie year that already next season drafters are going to be thinking that he could provide that Travis Kelce type of advantage. If Sam Laporta didn't have Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jameson Williams, and even David Montgomery on the roster, or he had a Patrick Mahomes as the QB, then I think he would be in the middle of round 1. So the idea that a rookie could have the type of season to put him in round one is viable. Certainly Kyle Pitts, after his 1,000-yard rookie season, was a viable first round pick at sort of the 1-2 turn. We all know how that worked out. That was an utter and cataclysmic
I think
disaster.
our first round show for the next year, we both had him going up even higher into the top 5. So the fact that you have Bowers here at 107 is not the highest we've taken a young tight end.
So when you're thinking through what Bowers could do, I think that one of the things that we have to be a little bit calibrated on is thinking in terms of where Marvin Harrison and Malik Neighbors are already going. And then work through in our heads, what's the actual positional advantage for a tight end by comparison, and what is the likelihood that we're seeing acceleration from rookie tight end performances? We don't have as many star tight ends as we have star receivers, so it's more difficult to say with assurance that these guys are also scoring earlier. But you think about what Kyle Pitts did just a couple of years ago, you think about what Sam Laporta did last year, you think about what Dalton Kincaid did over the second half of last season. And then when you think about, say, second year breakouts, and you think about what Trey McBride did, once the Cardinals finally said, okay, we'll play you. The ability of the young tight ends to create a massive structural advantage is there, and we're seeing the early scoring. Brock Bowers is a better prospect than all of those guys. Now, being a better prospect doesn't mean that he's going to hit a high-end outcome like you could certainly argue that some of those guys did, right? If you maybe come in more in the middle of your range, then perhaps he does what you have him ranked, which is maybe more reasonable. But when you think about the scoring trajectory, if Brock Bowers has a season like Sam Laporta, I do think he will go in the middle of round one next year. If he has that kind of fast finish to the season, like a Trey McBride or a Dalton Kincaid, and then you go back and you're looking at that profile and you're saying, how does he take the next step versus these guys that maybe we have a little bit more concern about, right? I mean, there are very, very good drafters out there who have a tiny bit of concern about Dalton Kincaid as a talent. It's very reasonable to look at Trey McBride and say, what if this is a little bit of a fluke? Because again, the Cardinals had to be really forced into playing him at all. I mean, there have to be some questions there. Now, I do point out with Trey McBride that he and Kyle Pitts gapped everybody else basically in terms of their final season yards per game. So it's not like he somehow materialized at the NFL level. He also runs like a mid 4.5, and Kyle Pitts runs like a sub 4.5. So, I mean, those guys are athletically separated. I don't think that we necessarily should have questions, but with Brock Bowers, we just don't have any questions if he hits. If he hits, people are going to say the next step is the middle of round one type of scoring. You're talking about Travis Kelce for a decade. That helps you more than picking some of these other guys who are also just very, very good.
Yeah, you definitely have me sold on that. You mentioned that I have him a little lower. Spoiler for the second round, we kind of go through these things in different orders. I have him at 211 at the back of the second round. I mean, think that's defensible too. A strong rookie year, but the other elite tight ends hitting might keep Bowers a little behind. But the profile and the way that you're talking through things, yeah, another one where I'm like, we probably could split the difference. I mean, I certainly feel like I could come up from there. So your 107 is Bowers. I already mentioned you have Hall at 112, and that my top 7 are your top 6 plus Hall. But our 8 through 11, Shawn, this is kind of hilarious that they are nearly identical. And it's interesting when you think through like, oh, how could you have Hall at 12? Well, think through these names, and I think you and I probably go through this exercise somewhat similarly, where it's like, yeah, like these guys still belong in the first round, so you wind up kind of putting them in these slots in the late first round. Part of the reason, like for me, Bowers winds up all the way at the end of round 2 because there's other good players that we're ranking too. And so I think this 8 through 11 thing where we're very similar, even though you have Bowers ahead of it and Hall behind it, and me vice versa, is more about like these 4 specific players and us thinking they're going to have good years and this is where they're going to land next year. And so at 108 for both of us, it is Christian McCaffrey. He's my RB3. He's your RB2 because you have Hall little later. But obviously, we both think Christian McCaffrey is going to score very well, but then be a year older next year and probably be a little bit more of a concern for drafters to where he slides to 108. Doesn't take a whole lot of rocket science to figure that out. At 9 and 10, you go Amon-Ra St. Brown, Malik Neighbors. At 9 and 10, I go Malik Neighbors, Amon-Ra St. Brown. We can certainly talk through that. We both have Amon-Ra St. Brown sliding a little bit from where the other receivers were that he's kind of being drafted around. We also both have Neighbors coming up, but not necessarily Harrison coming up, which is another very interesting conversation point. At 11, I'll just say, I think is more like the McCaffrey one that we probably don't need to spend a lot of time on. We both have Trey McBride. Everyone who's listened to the show knows that we're very high on Trey McBride. He's my tight end 1 going into next year. I think he's going to have 110 catches this year. I think he's going to absolutely smash in tight end premium. He paced for over 110 catches after he became a starter right around the Ertz trade. He actually started the game prior to the Ertz trade, but he had not played 60% of the snaps in any game up to that point. I believe it was week 8. So the first 7 games had not played 60% of the snaps. That week 8 game, he was at 83%. And the rest of the way, he was basically 70% or higher. Very clear role change. From that point forward, most of it with Kyler Murray, paced for 144 targets, 112 catches, massive numbers. His yards per out run, his targets per out run, when we control for this playing time element with McBride, meaningfully better than Sam Laporta. Not just a little better, but meaningfully better. He does have more target competition coming in. But the Trey McBride is tight end one thing. Very much a firm take that I'm in on. I'm pretty sure you're in on. It's not a bit. Trey McBride should be going ahead of Sam Laporta, who has Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, and the potential for a Jameson Williams breakout, weighing down his upside scenarios. Trey McBride has Marvin Harrison, but rookies are not going to have the same impact as an Amon-Ra St. Brown, immediately. So anyway, that is the take on McBride, who, by the way, also, you want to talk about the reception stuff and tight end premium, 74%, 76% catch rates. He's got a little bit of a lower ADOT, but he has incredible hands. He's been phenomenal at the catch rate element of it. So the targets turn into receptions at a really high rate, which is like an actual skill. I mean, he's like a Zach Ertz plus, right? Like this was Zach Ertz in his prime, was catching tons and tons of balls, or Jason Witten in his prime. But then McBride's also an absolute beast after the catch.
He's so fast. He's a 1,000-yard receiver in college.
Yeah, I mean, he's an absolute monster. We're both very, very high on him. We have him at 111. But let's talk about those two receivers at 109 and 110. Amon-Ra, Sean, I'll mention him real quick. I want to get your thoughts on Neighbors. Amon-Ra, for me, goes back to the Laporta thing, where the way I would describe it, I feel like I have kind of a quick way of describing it. We had him, I know I had him ranked like 6th overall this time last year, and he was going at the 1-2 turn. And by, the very late high stakes drafts, he had moved up, but he was a 1-2 turn guy for most of the offseason. He's a guy that I had as a clear target about 6th overall. And then this year he's going at about 6th overall, and he has this great season last year. And I basically think he should belong a little bit. Maybe those should be flipped. And the reason for that is, Sean, a lot of times drafters need to see stuff, but we're trying to predict forward. And so last year when we were trying to predict forward, it was again, I go back to this rookie stuff. Even if Sam Laporta hits, he doesn't hit in a massive target way as a rookie right away. Amon-Ra, pretty clearly the focal, or Gibbs, but Amon-Ra, pretty clearly the focal point of the passing game for 2023. Now going into 2024, you have this reality that Laporta has hit, and that Jahmyr Gibbs, who has the hamstring injury, is probably going to be used more in year 2 as well, especially in the passing game, because it was a little bit of an underwhelming first year from a receiving perspective for Gibbs. But Laporta has hit. And so now Amon-Ra's profile for next year as a lower ADOT guy who is he's a slot plus unique play. We've compared him to Kupp in the past, where the yak that he's able to add at his low ADOT creates this really massive depth adjusted efficiency. He's not totally knocking him for the low ADOT, but you do have to think through okay, he doesn't rack up massive numbers of air yards, and how that manifests for elite receiving seasons is trickier for a guy like Amon-Ra. You do need a lot of volume at that point. And when he has Laporta, the passing game, and some of those elements, to me, I get a little more concerned about where he's going this year in drafts. I still have him ranked favorably, but that's why I slid him back to 110 for next year. I don't think he has this exceptional season that we compare to the greats at the position next year and push him into the top 3 like Garrett Wilson could. Like you and I both think Garrett Wilson will, based on the way that we have him ranked. So that's why I'm at 10. I imagine, or I wonder if it's the same for you. I guess comment on that, but also talk a little bit about Neighbors and having him here at 110.
Yeah, you look at Amon-Ra, and I think it's a really difficult decision when you're on the clock in the middle of drafts this year, because I mean, his floor is better than that of Justin Jefferson. I think we're kind of getting into that range where it's better than Jamar Chase. And in some ways, that's not even that controversial a statement when you look at their 2024 3 seasons. It's obviously better than Garrett Wilson. And yet, as drafters process what happens, the other thing that I think is that Jared Goff is very much in the mix to set career highs, which would mean beating the season that he led the Rams to the Super Bowl and was involved in games like the 50-plus point affair with the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, that game did feature quite a few defensive touchdowns. But, I mean, the Lions are a team that they needed to score 50 this year in some games. They could do it. They're that potent, and Goff is that competent, right? He's in that same kind of range with a Kirk Cousins, where if you surround him with great coaching and unreal weapons and then let him move the ball, he's going to move the ball. So there are some counterbalancing structural elements that I think keep him very solidly in this first round. But yeah, just, I mean, they have so many people. You need a bunch of teammates to go down. And I mean, the Gibbs thing is already very frustrating. But Malik Neighbors, that one, and as it relates specifically to Harrison, is interesting. Obviously, it's controversial. His ability with the ball in his hands is absurd. What he was able to do last year as a young collegiate player, and again, I mean, he's playing with Jaden Daniels, who also had a fantastic season. And so you get those guys working off of each other and amplifying each other at least a little bit. They were kind of the catalyst for each other's massive breakouts. But you look at him with the Giants, and Ben, I think that he's so insulated because if the Giants attack works, he's going to be in the middle of it, and he's going to be the guy who has massive volume. We had a really disappointing development earlier today with Tyrone Tracy suffering an injury. Hopefully it's not as bad as it seems to be, but they are not going to have elite running backs. They don't have elite other receivers, despite, you know, how much I like Wan'Dale Robinson. With Neighbors, if the offense works, he's a star. If the offense fails, you have even more incentive to manufacture touches to him all over the place. You get him the ball, you let him run. He's this guy who should be fantastic for manufactured touches and should be able to get behind the defense. So you think about the different types of things that make a player work for fantasy football. Is you want really easy scoring to give you the floor, you want the vertical ability to give you the ceiling, and you want a player where even as a rookie, the volume should just be off the charts.
Yeah, he's, as I went through my projections, and I think I've given this take probably on the show recently, but it really crystallized for me that it's not just, I mean, and you were saying this pre-draft, you were saying that maybe Neighbors should be ahead of Harrison, but it's, you know, I think that was, you know, very profile based and some of those things, which isn't to say that you're not standing behind that or anything, but anyway, when I went through the projections, I definitely came away thinking that if Neighbors was priced where Harrison was and Harrison was priced where Neighbors was, I would think that would make more sense. And I'd probably be saying that I need to be in on both to a certain degree. It's not meant to be very anti-Harrison, but I've given the stat before where Justin Jefferson was an absolute smash as a rookie, 125 targets. Jamar Chase was an absolute smash as a rookie, 128 targets. Neither had a mobile quarterback. I think Marvin Harrison's going to be that type of an impact player, but if you have 130, I project him for like 135. I gave him more than that, you know, those guys' rookie years target share and then efficiency on top of it. But if you project Marvin Harrison for 135 targets for year one, he's overpriced right now. When I did, and so part of that comes down to the optimism for Trey McBride. Part of it comes down to the fact that I think Michael Wilson's really efficient rookie year is meaningful, and that Greg Dortch is somewhat meaningful, and that these guys are going to probably get some type of, you know, they're not going to steal from Marvin Harrison, but they're going to get some types of plays drawn up for him. Wilson's going to get some shots drawn up for him. They're going to matter to a degree. When I did the Giants projection, the Giants are in a desperation mode, I feel like, this season. They really want to show that Daniel Jones is, their quarterback of the future, or maybe they don't. I don't know. Some people have the theory that they want to distance themselves from Daniel Jones, I guess, and so they don't get fired, or the coaching staff and the front office doesn't get lose their jobs based on the Daniel Jones contract. I'm not entirely sure, but it seems very clear to me when I look at the receivers and the tight ends. There's no tight end presence. There's no receiver anywhere close to the presence of a Trey McBride. Wan'Dale Robinson is a very intriguing player, but it's Malik Neighbors or bust. It's like all of the manufactured touches, all of the stuff that we're doing has to go through Malik Neighbors. And so, and I just gave all those stats about the rookie receivers and how they hit and what it means. And the counter is like, well, what about Puka Nacua last year? He had 160 targets. Well, the guy who gets that type of a role because there's no one else in the passing game, to me, is Malik Neighbors. It just looks that way on paper when you go through the projection and you think through the roster. And then I think if Neighbors hits, then Wan'Dale and Hyatt and those guys that had a tough time last year might be able to operate around him. But their passing game was really bad last year, and he's the center of what has to work for the Giants this year. So I'm right there with you, Sean. I think Neighbors gets, and I'm actually projecting Neighbors and Harrison very close in volume in my actual projections. I'm just saying that when I went through it and thought through like ceiling outcomes, I think Neighbors gets more volume than Harrison pretty clearly. And I think people have talked about Harrison as a good pick at the 1-2 turn pretty solely around this idea of back-weighted production. The way I tried to frame it in my, off-season stealing signals post for the NFC West when I was writing up the Cardinals is that it seems to me like people are assuming like if there's 100 fictional fantasy points in a season, that the back-weighted production for Harrison is 30 in the first half and 70 in the back half. And these other receivers that go near him are 50 in the first half and 50 in the back half. And so you want those 70 in the back half. And the way that I'm seeing it is there's definitely 30 in the front half, and then he's 50 in the back half. But these other guys that he's going near are 50 and 50. Like they have the same ability to put up the kind of volume late in the year that we're hoping that Harrison will. Anyway, I'm not trying to hammer Harrison too much. It's more for the round 2 show because neither of us do have him in the first round. We do have him in the first half of the second round, both of us. So it's not like we're pushing him way down, but the way that I see the Cardinals season going, and especially, with Kyler, and I do think it's going to be a fun offense. We're going to talk a lot about them in the rest of these shows. Like I said, as we go into the Superflex, we'll talk about Kyler as well. Drew Petzing, really good coordinator last year with limited stuff around him, at least in my opinion. I thought he looked good, and I think that's a bowl element for Kyler as well. But to me, it just feels like Neighbors has that rookie full season type of ceiling where he's just that huge impact all year from week 1. I also think Harrison can be that type of player, which is why I'm projecting him to go very high next year as well. But essentially that it doesn't necessarily set up the same way. The way I think about it is that stat that we've talked a little bit about, Sean, the first read targets, where like when I gave that Jefferson and Chase stat, those guys were really good, but their production's still kind of back weighted because they needed to earn sort of the respect of the team and earn those first read targets later in the year. Then they're the focal point of the pass game by the later season. Neighbors is going to get those first read targets in week 1. The comparison that I heard on ADP chasing this week, I believe was Dwayne McFarland, our guest who brought it up, was Jalen Waddle's rookie year, where it's like they didn't have anything in Miami and they just threw a ton of stuff to Waddle underneath and said, catch and run all day. That's, again, can you get to that type of volume as a rookie is a little bit of a question. So anyway, Neighbors, really, really strong profile, and then the slightly better situation, I think, for smashing this year. That's why I have him at 109 next year. I think he has more fantasy points than Marvin Harrison this year, and that translates. And especially when I have McBride where I do, and I think McBride's catching 110 balls. For the record, I have Harrison projected for more targets than McBride, right? But like, I actually think if you really held my feet to the fire, I'd project McBride for more targets than Harrison. Like that's what I'm saying, because I think especially early in the year, that's where it will be. So Neighbor Sean comes in as a top 10 ADP for both of us. Harrison slides out of the first round. That means your first round is Justin Jefferson, Garrett Wilson, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, 5 receivers to start. Then Bijan Robinson, Brock Bowers, and Christian McCaffrey at 108. Amon-Ra St. Brown and Malik Neighbors, 109, 110. Trey McBride, 111, your tight end 2. Breece Hall, your RB3 at pick 12. 7 receivers in the first 10 picks, 2 tight ends, 3 running backs overall in the first round. My first round, we know 11 of the names. And the 12th name is the first player that one of us ranked and the other one didn't. And so I go Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Garrett Wilson, Tyreek Hill. And then that stretch where both of us have the same guys from 8 to 11, just Neighbors and Amon-Ra flipped in the middle. It's CMC, Neighbors, Amon-Ra, and McBride for me. Again, the one guy you had in your first round that I didn't was Bowers at 107. So I guess these are closer than I thought. I started the show saying we have way different lists, but they're fairly close. Now, again, the top 12 this year are pronounced in our top 12 for next year. We talked about that. The round 2 stuff is where we're really going to see some differences. But for me, Sean, those differences start right there at number 12. My RB4, who you don't have ranked, is not your RB4 because you have an RB4 coming up early in round 2. Is Devon Achane. And I do understand why you wouldn't have him ranked. I do want to start by saying I think there's a pretty big range of outcomes for him and where he lands next season. I just got asked a question from a subscriber over at Stealing Signals about Achane versus Puka for a keeper question. I was like, those guys are super close to me. The way that his league sets up at the Blues is like half PPR. He was like leaning towards Achane. And I was like, I can get that. But then I was like, if you have a multi-year element to it, I feel a lot better about Puka as a keeper again in 2025, frankly, because if Achane gets banged up in 2024 again, then we're probably like, oh, he's just too small. Like they probably add, or Jalen Wright, comes along, or the whole volume projection that a lot of people are out on Achane because there's not enough touches there becomes a real issue for him long-term if it happens again in year 2. And yet, if he stays healthy and the volume does take a step forward this year, then you get into the, okay, well, yeah, I mean, last year he was buoyed by 7.8 yards per carry, unsustainable efficiency, massive rushing efficiency. But we also around here aren't going to regress efficiency as much as other people might, right? And so if the volume spikes and he's this good in this offense, and, he scored 11 touchdowns last year behind Mostert, who led the NFL with 21. These two backs combined for 32 TDs in this offense last year. It's a stat I just keep hammering because if you're not in on Achane, Mostert, or Jalen Wright, I mean, you must be thinking that they're going to throw way more touchdowns, and then you should be in on Tua and Tyreek and Waddle like crazy. Or you think their whole team's going to crater. I don't know. But to me, there's plenty of room for Achane to maintain efficiency. Like as he starts to add touchdowns, he can also, add touches. He can also add touchdowns, right? Because this offense is going to generate those. He's going to lose some of the per touch yardage stuff. He's not going to average 8 yards per carry. It's just not, the rate of big runs can't be as extreme. And yet superstar players do superstar things, right? Like Jamal Charles, famously 5+ yards per carry every year for his whole career. Nick Chubb, famously, I got the big smile out of you, your favorite player of all time. Nick Chubb, famously, massive efficiency every single year. Chris Johnson, early in his career, you would have said, this guy can't keep hitting on all these long runs. And then he just kept being an awesome player for fantasy. One of my favorite notes on Achane is that when he played, and over the whole year last year, Miami's passing rate to their running backs is a note that I've talked in the past about being a little concerned about from this Shanahan scheme. They use the fullback a little bit. They signed Alec Ingold. He's kind of their Kyle Juszczyk. They throw to him a little bit. They threw to him less. And when Achane played, they threw to him with intent. His targets per out run was actually high for a running back. And he had a little bit of an ADOT, a little bit of an air yards component. They were like, we're getting the ball into this guy's hands. He didn't stay healthy enough for us to really see that receiving role materialize in a big way. But this question of like, can Jonnu Smith be the third weapon in the pass game? For me, this offseason has been like, no, because it's going to be Achane. If somebody actually materializes, because again, last year, their third best receiver in yardage was like 350 yards or something. It was Durham Smythe with like 350 yards. I think if somebody has 500 receiving yards as a third weapon in this passing game this year, it's Achane, because I think he, is going to be explosive in that part of the game as well. So you can see those scenarios where we get that young Chris Johnson, Jamal Charles efficiency season. And if that happens, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree. He could easily go 112.
Yeah, he can pop right back up there. He's currently going 210. And we do have 8 running backs in the first 2 rounds when we discuss this format that we're kind of looking at here. We actually have Saquon Barkley and Jonathan Taylor going at the 1-2 turn. Again, this is current ADP, not part of the exercise. But thinking through what drafters are likely to do, for me, I left both Achane and Kyren Williams out, even though I think they're set up in different ways to have very nice seasons. And the idea there was mostly exploring for myself what scenarios, again, are likely and how we would price those, and then how drafters would react if they feel like they can get that type of scoring in other places or they still have concerns. So one of the things that this current offseason has illustrated for me is that drafters are more effectively thinking through the threats to players to the point where I sometimes even disagree with it now. Because I think that in the past, those threats haven't been effectively realized. One of the reasons why zero RB has been so effective, because you could take those backs who were a threat, but people didn't want to give them credit. And then when they came through, you scored a lot of points and very inexpensively. We are seeing some respect being given to Gibbs and Achane for just how dynamic they were, even in a part-time role last season. The interesting thing, and I think something that won't necessarily continue, but we have to at least wait a little bit, is that given how many touches David Montgomery had last year, Gibbs ended up with actually a very viable expected points total, to where some of the things I think we're currently thinking about Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall in terms of how they separate from him are probably true, but not to the degree that we tend to think about, or at least I had been thinking about it. And so I'm a little bit more comfortable with Gibbs being close to them. And I've drafted him as a 1-2 turn guy in various formats this year to get some exposure, even though, my default has been he's overpriced. Going right back to this concern that we have about the Lions skill players, which is just there are so many good ones. How is that going to work? I think that you want to create exposure to Achane this year. I think you even want to make sure that you are creating exposure in Dynasty when he falls based on these concerns. I do think that 2025 has the potential to be a little bit tricky in that Mostert is going to score this season, and that is going to scare people for the future, especially when Jalen Wright is also going to look good. And a lot of the thought process on 2025 is going to be, well, even if we remove the veteran presence at some point, I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen, but if it becomes Achane and Wright, it's still problematic. Achane is an interesting guy because some of his college peripherals were not actually very good. And that was one of the reasons I was skeptical into the preseason last year. And then you start to look at what they're doing and you're like, you got to draft this guy everywhere, which was one of the reasons why he was a focal point of last year's zero RB list. My thought there is that Jalen Wright also has some red flags. And it was interesting because when Colum and I had folks on OT back in the spring, kind of the college football crowd, the guys who are really tuned into that, we had multiple guys say that Jalen Wright is not as good as his numbers. But you're going to have Mike McDaniel calling plays and creating huge space. And then you have a guy
and he's getting constant buzz out of camp. And I thought he looked amazing in the first preseason game too.
Yeah. So when you put that together, for me, he's somebody where I think fantasy managers in 2025 are going to say he looks like first half of the third round pick. Now, part of it too is just having a little bit of fun with it because I've got some very controversial players at the end of round 2. If you told me that Achane was just a cement lock, clear cut, has to be in the first 2 rounds as opposed to the guys I have in the back 5, I would have no problem with that whatsoever.
But you make some good points. I think a big part of it for me was thinking through how he's valued right now, even with Mostert on the roster, and the fact that I do think, in the optimistic scenarios for the way his season plays out, that efficiency is going to play up so meaningfully that I think he would go into 2025 for people looking like one of the 5 best running backs in the league. Like the way that Gibbs is priced right now, you talk through, there's some real upside stuff to his work, but some of it also is just a talent bet on him and how he looked last year, because the receiving didn't really materialize in the way that we completely wanted to, based on a truly astounding receiving profile from college. And he still had good receiving numbers last year. I'm not saying they were bad, but there's this element at running back that we also see at receiver in the modern fantasy landscape where people are willing to bet on talent a little bit for sure. And I think that is true of Achane's price this year. And so maybe would carry over next year, especially if he has another really efficient year. For him, it's a make or break kind of year. I looked at it as a favorable one where, I do think he has a real ceiling, and I know you do too. Like he definitely is somebody that you take and that we take and has ceiling outcomes, but you also talked through some scenarios where sure, he would be more of a third round pick, like you said. Like people would be worried about the volume more and say, see, we should have been more concerned about the volume last year when you guys wanted to take him in the second. We're going to take him in the third or the fourth or whatever, that he's more of a committee back or something. Definitely can envision that. So he's my 112. I just read the rest of my first round a moment ago, read yours as well, Sean. So that's sort of the recap of round 1.